good morning, everyone. And also, if anyone is watching from Europe, good evening, Europe. And welcome to the live stream of Plan B project. Today, we'll have few speakers who will talk about different aspects of game development and other areas of game industry. And today, our first speaker would be Juan de Urraza. So he's the CEO of Possibility Tech, and he will talk about running your game development company as a startup. So Juan, please.
Hello everyone. I'm really happy to be here and sharing the little knowledge that I have with you. I'm very happy also to be here and grateful to Kate Edwards and all the team behind Plan B, so all the developers who could not come to GDC can at least share some knowledge and try to move forward in their projects. So the idea of this talk is talk about it, how indie studios can work as a startup, because the startups and the indie game development studios have similar situations, problems, and they can tackle that problems in the same way. And the startup community has been working very long time to tackle these issues, so we can learn a lot from them to have our studios working in the best way possible and surviving. So, who we are? I'm Juan de Urraza. I am the founder of Possibility Tech, a game development studio from Paraguay. We work in the location-based space, and we were founded as a startup originally, not as a game development studio, because our project was working with the location-based games for marketing, and that was we do at the start of the project. We were a startup. Then we became a game development studio. So we passed through the first phase of a startup, and we learned a lot while doing that. This is our game. Factions is a location-based game. We worked 4 years in that game. We lost a lot of money. It was not a profitable business, but the company still holds, so some things were done in a good way. Okay, let me take my notes. A little mixed up. Okay, so let's continue. Well, you know how the video game industry, how big it is and how competitive it is. So there's a lot of opportunities, but it's a really complex world and very competitive. So we need to be prepared to survive, because otherwise the big guys will eat us. And like I say, there's a lot of competition. We can see in this chart the number of games put on Steam every year and how they're growing so fast. So there was a time where putting a game out in the market was enough to have an audience, but now the stores are so cluttered that having a good game is not enough. And also we have the fragmentation of platforms. So there's not only developing a video game, but you need to port to several platforms. That is expensive, that is complex, and you need to think about it. Well, and we have other issues. The development costs are really high and are getting higher. You need more people, more artists, more programmers to do a good game. You need to understand if you want to go on the premium side, on the free-to-play side, and there's a lot of uncertainty. So you never know what will happen. Even big blockbusters games can fail. So for a big company, that is a problem, but they probably will survive because they are launching a lot of games in a period of time. But sometimes for an indie game company, if they develop a game and it fails, there's no way to recover from that failure. So that's why we need to think a lot on how we will survive in the future. So, startup for gaming. Traditional startups, like I said, face the same difficulties as indie game developers, especially to free-to-play indie game developers, but for everyone. And these startups have developed a set of tools and solutions to reduce this uncertainty and have more chances to success. You can never be sure that you will be successful, but you can tackle some issues to have more probabilities to success. And we can learn a lot of them. Mostly are concepts that you might hear of. I will just pass very fast all these concepts because there's a lot of information, but you can later do some research on the ones that you are more interested if you never heard about it. So we will talk about some basic concepts first. The most important one that we learn as a startup is that the cemetery is full of good ideas. So a lot of people say, hey, I had a very good idea, but I will not tell anyone because they will rip off my idea and develop a game or a service or whatever similar to mine. And the truth is, that is the first mistake a lot of people do, people without experience. Nobody will steal your ideas. People who rip off ideas from other people like to rip off successful ideas. So they will rip off the most successful games or service or whatever. An idea is just too risky for them. So please just share your ideas, find people who will love their ideas, who will work with you, who will put money in there, and forget about holding up just for you and take it to the grave with you. We learned that when we've been accelerated 2 times, one in Finland and other time by Google in their Indie Games Accelerator program in Singapore. And this is one of the issues that we talk a lot. Okay. Other thing that is important to know is the red ocean versus blue ocean dichotomy. And you need to know when you will develop a game which side you will be. Red oceans are full of similar projects or games or services, and you know that you will have a lot of fierce competition. And if you will get into red oceans, you need to work and launch a game in a specific way. But there is a demand. You know that there is people interested in that. And there you want to offer a service or a game that is maybe cheaper or better or have a different solution to a current problem or whatever. But you can also go to the blue ocean. The blue ocean is without competition, is a wide open space where you can do a lot of things, and you might be successful because there's lack of competition. But as is an untested waters, maybe nobody's interested in your service. You don't have where to get insights or ideas on how your game will work. So it's very difficult to be a successful video game developer in a blue ocean. You can do something very creative, but nobody will like it. But if you do the right thing, you can be the head of the spear and become a number one and a big one. So you need to select which of the 2 ways you will work and think about it, not just let you go. Think what of the 2 is the best suit for the game you're developing and plan your strategy according to that. Okay, let me see. Okay. Small business are driven by profitability and long-term value, but startups are focused on top-end revenue and growth potential. So Due to the limited revenue or high cost, most of these small-scale operations are not sustainable in the long term without additional funding. That probably will happen with an indie game studio. They have a very cool idea, they want to develop and launch their game, and they might work like 3 or 4 years in this game before releasing. But they need to pay the rent, eat, and have a good life while they develop this. Startups have the same problem. A lot of startups don't produce money for a lot of time and they need funding. So we can learn from them how to do that. Other important thing, sorry, is in Spanish, in a Jopara mix of languages. The other thing is you need to understand where phase your company is. The startup system already have their ways, and we can learn about it. We have the pre-seed phase where you have no money at all and you are just working on an idea. You have the seed phase where you get some small money to work on your idea and create a prototype and see if it works. And you have the early stage when you have to create a minimum viable product, an MVP, where you will show that this will work and people will say to you, yeah, I'm interested, I tested it, it's good, I want the product. Then you will continue growing and launch the product. During that stages, you have what is called the Valley of Death Valley. This Death Valley is the time that you will have between you received your first money to start in your project and you start earning money later, or you have the second round of investment. And that's where most of the projects die, because you got a little money, you think you will be able to pull this project, and in the end, the money run out before you're able to deliver, and you have no ways to continue the project. So most of the CEOs must try to avoid the Valley of Death in different ways and have enough money to grow and to develop the game until the end and the launch. Okay, also you know the startup success rate in the United States is about 10%. So 90% of the startups fail. You know as an indie developer how many games are on Steam or the Play Store or the App Store that doesn't have enough downloads to be profitable. So we are kind of in a similar situation with the startups. And you must know that that will happen. So the first thing you need to do here is try not to put your own money in your project. Try to put or get investors who, in the worst case scenario, will lose little amount of money, but they will not lose their houses or cars, or they will not. They will still be able to take their kids to school if the project fails. Of course, you will share the earnings in the end, but it's way better to secure funding and to be able to deliver than to fail and don't know what to do with your life. You need to learn from your mistakes, and it's impossible to be an entrepreneur without making mistakes. We have a different situation maybe in Paraguay where I live, where if you do a mistake, probably you will never be able to do a project again, because failure is seen as a really, really bad thing. But in other countries like United States, failure is not seen so bad, because it is assumed that you will learn a lot from your mistakes. And that's why 20% of founders who failed in the first startup have a higher successful rate when they try again. So they double the chances of success even if they failed before. So failing is not that bad. What you need to do is fail fast. All the startups need to fail fast. You will try, and if something is not working, you will shift, you will pivot and try another thing and continue trying the best to deliver. And even if you know that it will fail, just cut out and start another project can save you that. And it will be really hard for you if you stay working several years in a project that in the end probably will fail. And we know, everyone knows the Angry Birds story. They tried to develop more than 50 games, none was successful. They were about to go to bankrupt, and in the end, they created Angry Birds when they were about to close the company, and now they are who they are. So if you keep trying fast, you have more chances to be successful. If we see the top reasons of why startups fail, you will see that make a lot of sense, and have a bad product or having a good product or whatever is not the main reason. So you need to tackle these issues also to be more likely to succeed. So the first reason why a startup fails is that there's no market. So you're creating a product that nobody wants, nobody needs. You're creating a mix of game types that never been done before, but maybe it's a mix of hardcore with a casual gameplay that nobody will want to play. So you need to find your market fit. Then you run out of cash. Like I said, projects get bigger than you think, and you don't have money to finish the project. You don't have the right team. You're working with your friends. You love your friends. You're working together. You're really happy, but you're not good, or some of your team is not good doing what they do, and the product is not good enough. The competition beats you. Obviously, that can happen. Your game can be too expensive, or it's a free-to-play that people in the end feels there's no need to put money in the game. It's not user-friendly. You don't have a good business plan. And there's tons of reasons. Those are the main reasons. So you need to focus on the most important ones and trying to tackle them. One of the big things that you can learn from the startup world is to do the business canvas, where you can, I will not teach you how to do business canvas, but there's a lot of books about it. You identify your key partners, activities, resources, costs, revenue, your unique value proposition that will get people interested in your product, how you will work with customers, what segments of customers you will have, channels of distribution, etc. And if you are able to figure it all out, you have way more chances of success that avoid thinking of it, and when the time comes, you didn't resolve a lot of issues. So the business model canvas is really useful, and I believe in the gaming industry can also be really useful for indie game developers. The other canvas that is very interesting is the persona canvas. You know, a lot of game developers love their games, and they say, oh, this game will be awesome, we'll have this and that, but they're not thinking who will play the game. So the age, the gender, the time zone they live, the type of cities they live, etc. And you develop a game that in the end is not interesting for the kind of person you thought it will play it, and that may be really a problem. But if you understand who is your player, why he plays, why he will continue playing in the long end, or why he will pour money in your game, that will help you design the game. So the persona canvas can really help you on that regard. Okay, and we want to found a startup or a game development studio. You need to have a lot of things in mind. One, who will your co-founder? Solo founders have a higher rate of failure. So if you are 2 or 3 people, co-founders that can help together and grow together, there's a lot of more possibilities to be successful. You can see this picture. You know, Steve Jobs without Steve Wozniak, or Steve Wozniak without Steve Jobs probably will not. Apple will not exist if those two didn't work together. One was a genius on hardware and software, and the other was a genius trying to sell that to the people. So you need to work with co-founders that have the knowledge and the skills that can help your company to succeed. And you need to create a company structure. You will have a team. Who will be in your team? Who will you recruit? You will work everyone in your home, like this coronavirus issue. You will work all together in an office. How much will be the pay, etc. You need to grow your company. And the people is in video games, human resources is the most important resource. Everything, all the other things are way less important than the people. So you need to get the right team. Without the right team, you will not be successful. And you need to found your company. You need to sign contracts. You need to have bank accounts. You need to pay taxes. You need to share responsibilities. So for you, as a game developer, when you found your company, you need to think in all of these things, because they will not disappear. And if you don't feel comfortable doing, please have a partner who is comfortable with that. Intellectual property is really a big thing, and a lot of people doesn't think about it and doesn't have contracts. And in the end, you've heard a lot of stories. A programmer quits. There are 3 friends working together, and the programmer quits, and he says, okay, but the source code is mine. It's my intellectual property. I will not share it anymore with you. And the project is doomed. So you need from the start, even with your friends, to sign contracts on what are the responsibilities, how you will work, what will happen if someone quits the company, whatever. Because these kind of things can cause the total destruction of a project. And on the human resources side, you need to think on how you will select people, how will you administrate your company, if you will give equity to the developers and they will work for free or way cheaper than a developer that will charge full. You must define the salaries, you must distribute earnings and bonuses, etc., etc., etc. At the start, we're all friends, but if you are working 3 or more years in a project, in the end, you might end this project without being friends. So please work in contracts and try to remain friends. Okay, we have also the entrepreneur ecosystem. In some countries, the countries have the whole ecosystem to help the entrepreneur. Like here in Silicon Valley, you have everything. You have the big companies, you have support organizations, you have the universities, you have funding, VCs, service providers, research organizations, you have everything. But in small countries like us, in Paraguay, we don't have everything. We don't have funding. We don't have research on the universities. We don't have big companies for support. So it's way harder for us to grow a company. So a lot of companies try to work with the United States or with Europe and get to the rest of the ecosystem they don't have. And you must know that you need this ecosystem. So if you're in a country where the ecosystem is not completed, you need to think on how you will be able to get to the other part of the ecosystem even outside your country. Okay, let's talk about pitching. Pitching is one of the most important things in startups and is one of the most important things in indie video game development. You need to pitch all day and try to get funding for your projects, or a publisher, or even pitching to new developers that will work with you. You need to convince them that this is the best project they will be able to work in the future. And there we comes to the elevator pitch. You know how this elevator pitch works? It says that if you cannot explain your game idea in less than a minute to someone who is even outside the industry, you are not prepared to receive investment. You need to pitch clearly to anyone your game idea or the project you're on, and they must understand what is happening in less than a minute. It's called the elevator pitch because you are on an elevator and, I don't know, Bill Gates just gets into the elevator and you want to tell about your wonderful idea that will change the world, and you have only 10 floors to tell him your idea before he gets off of the elevator, and you need to be able to do it. So that is why it's called the elevator pitch. And everyone needs to practice their pitch and be able to do it in less than a minute in any language that is needed. My main language is not English, and it's difficult for me to do it, but all my meetings are in English, so I need to practice my pitch in English. And the truth is, I practice so much my pitch in English that is way better in English than in Spanish. In Spanish, I don't even know the words I need to use anymore for the pitch. And you will pitch to investors, publishers, and inside your own company, your coworkers, to convince them to develop a new game, for example. And you need to understand there are different kinds of pitch, and it will depend on who are you pitching. You might be pitching to a new player, to a customer, to an investor. So you need to say different things to every one of them. You need to prepare different pitches from them. And you need to know how long you will be able to pitch. If it's someone you will bump in GDC the next year, maybe you have only a minute to talk about it before he goes away. Maybe you have a meeting. The meeting will be of 15 minutes. Okay, you have more time. You can show slides or whatever. So it will depend in a lot of things, but you need to be prepared to pitch in a minute or in 10 minutes, dependent on the situation and who is hearing your pitch. So, and for investment, there's a lot of ways to grow your indie game development studio, and all the startups have their own ways, and we can learn a lot about it. So obviously the first possibility is bootstrapping. So you must try to be self-sustainable. You can develop small projects. You can do work for hire. You can seek investment. You can do a lot of things to be self-sustainable in the medium and long run. And while you are sustainable, you start to grow your own projects. That's a good way to do it, because if you create a studio and this studio receives investment and depends full on the investment, the day the investment ends, you will not be able to sustain your studio anymore. But if you are doing works that are able to pay your bills and pay your developers, you can get also investment for new projects, but you know you will continue over time. It will be slow, probably. The development of your new games will be really slow, but you will be able to survive. And in the end, that's the most important thing. And we learned it in the hard way. When we started as a startup, we just worked for 4 years only with investment. And our investors didn't want us to bootstrap, didn't want us to work on new projects to be able to pay the bills in the future. But they suddenly one day they say, okay, we'll not pour more money in the company and see what you can do. And at the time, we were not prepared to offer work for hire services or other services, and it took like 8 months for us to start to be, say, self-sustainable, but we were almost bankrupt at the time. Okay, you also need to understand the break-even point. So you need to have more revenue than costs to be profitable. That's your objective. And you have the break-even point, where is the point where you will be able to survive in the future because you can pay your bills. So that is very important. You must know what your expenses are, how many money you need, and how will you get that money. Okay, and if you want to get investment, there is a lot of sources. These are for regular startups, but that works also for game development studios. Obviously, the first thing you can do is put your own money. Like I said, is the worst thing you can do, or the best if you're a very rich person. But if you're not a rich person, you cannot put in jeopardy your future for a project. You need someone who has the money, who can help us. So family and friends can help you. You can receive a grant from your government. You can win a competition and receive a small amount of money to start your project. You can get a loan. I believe it's also not the best thing to do. You can use your credit card. You can, get different kinds of credit. And the other thing you can do is go to an incubator or an accelerator. These programs prepare you to be able to be successful. And if you do really well in the program, they may give you money to start your project. And they will put mentors that will help you. And in the end, they can help you getting a publisher. And at the start of the startup scene, there were no accelerators for gaming, but now there are some in different parts of the world, so you can apply to them, and you will learn a lot, and you will receive a lot of coaching. You can go crowdfunding, but crowdfunding is hard, and it's not for everyone. So you need to think a lot and do research to see if crowdfunding is good for you and your project. For an example, free-to-play games are not good for crowdfunding. So you will probably fail if you have a free-to-play game. But premium PC games are different. And premium PC games in different styles have different chances of being successful in crowdfunding. And if you have someone famous behind that, it will be easier. So you need to think about it. You can receive money from angel investors. That's a good thing. And you have then venture capitals. But venture capitals usually don't fund the start of a project. They will get later when a project is already successful. So VCs are not for the first stages. And obviously you can have an IPO or rounds of investment, Series A, B, but also they will only invest in something that currently is successful. And you need to know the valuation. If you will receive investment, how many shares you will give in exchange of that money, and what the value of the company will be depending on that. That is complex. There's several ways of calculate the valuation. We'll not get into that, but you need to think about it, because the first time you meet with a VC or with an angel investors, they will ask you about the valuation. And if you don't know, they will understand that you don't understand how that works. And probably they will never call you again. So you need to know about it. Video games has a very unique investment partner, that is the publisher. They give you money, but usually they don't take equity of your company. So they are partners only in a specific project, and that is great. So publishers are a good thing if they are good publishers. Good publishers might give you money to develop the project, and they will put a lot of money into the marketing and launch of the game. That is really expensive, and it's really difficult to do it by yourself. So publishers are good, but not all the publishers are the same. And there's a lot of stories of people who got ripped off on publishers, took a lot of huge chunk of the money and did little investment in marketing. So you need to be careful on who the publishers are and the type of offers they will give you. But they're a really unique thing in the video game industry, and very, very useful for indie game developers also. Okay, the phases. The startups has phases, and the game development have the same phases also. So we can learn from them, and trying to be successful doing what they are already doing. So the first thing is to understand how a project or a startup grows. And they start like as a problem or a solution fit. In video game, it's difficult to get that because games are entertainment. There's not really a problem to solve, but still, people want to get entertained. So if you have a good way of entertaining them, a specific style of a game or whatever, you can put that there. Then you get to the concept, then you start your project, then you validate your ideas. At the stage of validation, you probably will get into the lean startup. We'll talk a little more about that, but you will create your MVP, like we talk about it, and you validate that MVP with people and see if they will really want their game before get to full production. Then once you validate your MVP, you can scale, you can launch, you can do the marketing, whatever, you can finish the product, and then you will scale. You need to have servers that don't collapse with a lot of people playing. When we launched our first game, Factions, we had a spike in one day. We had, 1,000 people playing, and the next day we've been featured by Google, and we had 90,000 players, and we collapsed. And that was a huge hit for us because we probably will get some money from those people who wanted to play, but they were not able to play it at all for 2 days. So that's not good. You need to scale and be able to deliver to the gamers, because they will not get back to your game. If they test the game and it's not working, they will just delete it and never try it again. Okay, and the lean startup. The lean startup is a very interesting concept where you think a new idea, you create a hypothesis, you create your minimum viable product, you test the product, and you iterate. You learn, you see in a video game, you will maybe go to a conference, PAX, wherever, and you will show the people your MVP, your small prototype, and they will play, and you will know if they will love it or not, or what things you need to change or improve, and then you will test it again until your product is really interesting for your audience, and then you will go and commit to full development and to a launch. So Lean Startup will help you a lot in avoiding a great failure. And you will learn very early on that this will not work, and you can work in another project, or you can pivot to another direction. So it probably you probably will be able to get a better product in the end. Also, You know, the lean startup have, like I said, all this graphic is similar, it's just more detailed, but you will identify the need, you will research, you will prioritize what things will be put inside your game, you will do some brainstorm, concepts, hypotheses, you will build a prototype, you will start to try it with people, pivot, and once the product is good and you know that it will work, you go to the release phase. And on the release phase, you will also, in all the games as a service, will continue working on the game and improving depending on how people use it. In the video game industry, we have more than MVP. A lot of people works on the vertical slice. The vertical slice is a finish level where a player can play and understand how the game will look and how fun it will be. And the vertical slice is used to convince investors or publishers to fund your product and to help you. And a vertical slice needs a lot of work, but it's a lot less work than a full game. So it will be cheaper to develop this vertical slice with the full art, with all the game mechanics, so people can test it, and if everything is okay, you will be able to get funding. So vertical slice is a very important and unique thing in video games. Okay, then we have project management. A big problem small indie studios have is that they don't have project managers. They just are a bunch of friends working together in an office and in a not very ordered way. And that's a problem, because if you have a project management, you will identify issues that can stop or can delay some parts of the project if they're not done at a specific time. And a project manager is the one who will work on that. And if you cannot afford a project manager, some of you will need to be the project manager. And it's hard, you need preparation for that, but it will help you a lot in avoiding the possibility of failure. And usually the project manager works in several stages, and in each stage the project manager do different works. So in this graphic we can see the different work that a project manager needs to do in the different stages. But we will continue with other things because this is complex thing. Okay, and when we talk about development and MVP and vertical slice, we also need to understand and select how we will work. The worst thing you can do is just to sit and start coding without any order on the team. So you need to prototype, and there are frameworks to do that. And you need to develop, and there are also frameworks to do that. So you have the spiral, you have the waterfall model, you can use the Scrum with the agile methodologies. You will select the best suite for you, and you must know that a lot of people will tell, no, you must do agile, you must do this way. No, each project and each team may find different ways to work in a project. So you need to understand the different approaches and select the best one for your team. We started with Scrum and it was not good for us. We ended with just a Trello with a backlog and someone who puts the main things on the top, and we just take that, and that's the best way to do it for us. So everyone can do or can select the best proposition. You need also to work a lot on UX and UI. Your game can be great, but if it's not easy to use or to understand how you can play, and if it's not really beautiful to the eyes of the players, and being beautiful can mean anything, but for this specific persona that we spoke before, there must be a specific graphical design and art that is good for them. And you need to know that, and you need to work on that. And if you forget this and only in the end you're trying to patch things to make it better, it probably will not be good. And we reached the point where, okay, we developed the game, we believe it's ready to launch. What can we do? How we will launch? And also, the startup world has a lot of answers for that. First, you need to deal with the stores. If you have a publisher, your publisher will do it for you. But a lot of small indie studios don't have publishers, so they work directly with the stores, and that is hard. Stores have a lot of complexities, approvations, in-app purchases that need to be put in each of the stores in a different way. You need to do the ASO, the store optimization, the App Store optimization. You need to, you want to be featured, and to be featured, you also need to do a lot of things. You need to have your game in multiple languages, compatible with the latest devices they are trying to sell to you. You need to do a lot of work. So that is hard, and you need to know that. Also, you need to think on how you will be launching. Even if you have a publisher, probably you will do a soft launch. A soft launch is a small launch in a country or in a city or in a place where you can know everything that's happening without impacting your whole audience. And once you understand that everything is okay, that the servers will not fail, that the people will put money on your game, then you do a full scale launch. So the soft launch, all the early access are tools to help you tuning everything for the final launch. And like I said, the App Store optimization is complex, and you need someone who understands that to help you. And if you don't, probably what will happen is that nobody will know about your game because you don't have a lot of money to put into marketing, and you worked a lot of time in a game that nobody will play, and then you will, I don't know, go into GDC to tell how bad you failed and the mistakes you made. So there are a lot of visibility problems in the stores right now. There are too many games, so only being there is not enough. You need to work on the perfect icon for your app or game. You need to think a lot on the name, title, and subtitle of your game, the images you will put, the video you will put there, the description. You must put it in multiple languages. It will be better to get more downloads. The ratings are really important. If you put your game and you start receiving bad ratings, the algorithms will hide your game and nobody will be able to see it, and that can mean the failure of your game. And there's very important to receive feedback from players on the stores, answer them, and keep them happy. And there's a lot of ways to do user acquisition. There are organic ways and paid ways. If you have money, everything is easier, not cheaper, but easier. But a lot of indie game companies who don't have a publisher will have problems and need to work a lot. So you need to work with the press, YouTuber, events, have your web, have a devlog, try to win some awards, try to get a feature in the stores. Everything can help you. But grow a community is the most important one. So you need to grow a community around your upcoming game, so when it gets out, there's a lot of people interested who will buy it. And to do that, you need to work way before the launch, 1 or 2 years before, if you can. For the paid user acquisition strategies, obviously you can put ads on social networks, on Google. You can go to traditional media, and you know that it's really expensive. And the main problem we have now as indie game developers is that putting ads in social networks or in other networks is really expensive. And if you're a free-to-play game, you might have the problem that it's more expensive to get players than the money the players give to you. So you cannot do that. Big publishers have big wallets, so they can do that. But small indie game developers cannot do that. And talking about that, here you see a small graphic about the cost of user acquisition. And you know the user acquisition is growing, but the players' expenditure is not growing that fast. So every year is harder to pay to the networks to get users. So it's a really difficult situation right now. And the other important thing you need to understand, and this is for startups, but also for video games, is the life cycle of the player. So you acquire the player, you need to to have retention, they need to keep playing, they're engaged, and then they will monetize in a free-to-play environment. And if they are engaged, they will help you go viral to get new players. But in any step of this chain, they might churn and never play your game again. So you need to focus on each step on how you will be able to go to the next step. And that is the funnel. You need to understand how they are exposed to your game, how they discover your game, why they consider to buying or installing your game, how they will convert into paying customers, and how you will have the retention to be able to monetize in the long run also. And in each phase of the funnel, there are things you can do, and there are situations why they will churn out, and you need to understand, think a lot about it to be successful. Also, other things that came from the startup world and is really used in video games now is the A/B testing. So the idea is that if you are not sure if something will work well, you can develop two versions of this thing and have different people using the different versions and look at the KPIs and understand which of the two is the best one, and then select that version for the whole audience. And that way you can improve monetization, engagement, a lot of things. Because you're a video game developer, you have your friends, you're working, and someone comes with an idea. Hey, I want to, put daily reward. Yeah, that's a cool idea. Yeah, let's put a daily reward. But you don't understand that putting a daily reward is a new screen that pops up on the screen every time you open the game on a day. People don't like that. They stop playing. You don't know what will happen. So you can test that in a small group of people and compare with the regular players and see if they improve or not the KPI you want to improve. But you need to know which KPI is the one you want to improve. If you don't know that, this testing has no use. And talking about KPIs, maybe someone doesn't understand what it is. So KPIs are the strategic indicators that make possible to you to understand and to measure if a project is going well. And there are different KPIs. The KPIs can be how well player monetize, how long they play, the retention, the LTV. There's a lot of KPIs, and different games are interested in different KPIs. It's not the same a free-to-play game, a full paid game. It's different. So you need to understand the KPIs and select the ones that are important for you and work to improve these KPIs over time. And you can set your OKRs. OKRs are the same as KPIs, but are the objective, where you want to go with these KPIs. So you can say, okay, I want to have 1,000 players per day. That's my OKR. Now my KPI is only 500 players per day. How I will grow in 500 more players? Or my cost per install, I want to get lower, or I want to extend the LTV, or whatever. You have a lot of KPIs, and obviously you want to work on all of them, but you need to work on the most important for your game. Like I say, startups do this all the time. And okay, you need to do QA. A lot of developers forget about it, and they launch a game with bugs or problems or crashes, and people hate that. And once that happens, they will just uninstall the game and play another thing and never come back to your game. So it is really important that games pass through the QA process and ship without bugs if possible. And if you found bugs, you need to correct them very quick and launch a new version as sooner as you can. Okay, we have the growth hacking. Growth hacking is a startup way of doing things. It's very similar to what we talked. You launch a game or you launch a product, you test your KPIs, you select one KPI you want to improve, you do small changes to that, and you see if that works. You can do A/B testing or not, but you test, and you say the KPIs, how much they change, and if they're good, okay, you can go to another thing, and if they're bad, you go back or you change again things to improve it. So that's a way to work with games as a service also. And you need to do live ops. Live ops are necessary to have an engaged audience because people get bored after a while of playing your game. So you need to put new things all the time so they keep engaged. So you can do special events, seasons, new cosmetic items, time-limited offers, campaigns, whatever. You need to do a lot of this to keep your people, your players engaged. And that is very important in games that are free to play and are services. And you need to do community management. If you don't do a well community management, that can mean the failure of your game. Trying to be polite with the people, hear what they say, make the changes they ask, work with the stores, in social networks, have channels like Discord, have your web page, a lot of ways so you can interact with your audience and so they understand your roadmap for the future, and maybe so you can tell the issues or problems you have and explain why you have it, so they can be more forgiving when some problems arise. So community management is really important and someone needs to do that. Okay, and the other very important thing is work on measuring everything. Like I say, your KPIs are really important, and if you can understand what is happening in your game, you can take quick decisions. So working on analytics and put analytics on your game is really, really important. All the startups do that, so they need to understand what part of this product people like, why this is never used, how many minutes per day are connected, what they do, the first time user experience, and where people quit in their first user experience, etc., etc., etc. So you need to work on analytics. There are some free tools, some paid tools to do that, but it's really important for you to understand your game. And in the end, you need to attend to events and do networking because you're not an island. And if you are a solitary developer who never speaks with anyone and then have a beautiful game and you just put it in the stores and launch it, and then you say, okay, but nobody likes my game. Yeah, nobody knows about your game. Nobody knows about you. Nobody knows that you exist. You need to share with other people, learn from them, teach if you know something, also share what you know, and work together as a community to be able to grow as game developers. So this is from the past year, or delegation from Paraguay. We're trying to grow as a community, and we're starting to work together, different studios in bigger projects, and that will make us profitable and probably improve our chances of success. So that is really important. And that's it. It was a very long presentation, I believe, but I just wanted to really quickly tell about all these things and you must do research on each one. I just wanted to tell you that the startups works really similar to the game development studios, and you can learn from the startups how to avoid failure, and that will be really, really great for you. So thanks a lot, and I hope that all the other presentations will be really good also. So please keep tune, share the links to more people so the Plan B can be really successful. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Juan, for presentation, and I really hope we'll have more indie game developers to start their own projects. And of course, it's always great to see more developers coming up with the new games that are becoming more and more successful. We will have a 10 minutes break, and after that we will welcome our next speaker. It's Kate Edwards. She's Executive Director of Global Game Jam. So stay connected, and we'll be back in 10 minutes.
One thing, can I see my slides though? There you go. Hi everybody, welcome back to the Plan B project. Just a quick update. As you might have noticed, for some of you who are trying to figure out who's talking when and what our schedule is like, at the moment, our schedule that's posted online on the planbproject.org website is out of date. So we're trying to update that as fast as possible because, as you can imagine, this entire thing has been a mad scramble and it's been very busy, very hectic to try and piece together something for people to enjoy in the absence of GDC's postponement. So just kind of bear with us. I mean, we're going to do our best to get the schedule correct as fast as we can. A lot of that depends on having our speakers reconfirm their times, which we're doing at this very moment. So, because some people noticed that why did I not start at 10 a.m. like the schedule says? Well, we didn't. So anyway, if you're there with me now and listening, fantastic, because I would like to talk about my background expertise, which is culturalization. So in addition to working in the game industry for almost 27 years now, what I've done in all that time is I'm a geographer who does culturalization work. So I basically help companies avoid political and cultural issues and things that can get them into trouble while they're creating their games for a global audience. I do also run the Global Game Jam, and I do a lot of other advocacy work in the industry, but the point of this talk is really to focus on the culturalization aspect. So let's kind of buckle up and get into the topic. So as you know, I mean, a lot of the worlds that we play, a lot of the worlds that we make as game developers, they are very complex. Sometimes they're very realistic, something like Skyrim, which is, very, very detailed. It's very realistic, and yet it takes place in a completely fictional universe. Things like Halo, which actually takes place in our universe, but it's in the far future. So it involves a lot of science fiction elements and things of, basically imagining things the way they might be at the time, encounters with alien cultures and all of that. And yet it still adheres to the rules of our universe because it does take place in our future. Games like No Man's Sky, when they're doing the world building for a game like that, a lot of the mechanics of world building are actually baked into the code itself. So it's procedurally generated. So essentially all the rules around world building that typically developers will kind of think about very carefully, they did think about very carefully, but then they coded it all. So it basically does that in that procedural manner, which is pretty fascinating because you have these worlds being created on the fly as you encounter them. And so it's basically a whole new, unique world that's being built without quite the same intention as you'll find in other worlds. Even something like Super Smash Brothers, this is a world, even though it's, a basic kind of fighting game, it's still a world, it still has an environment, it still has a narrative. So there is thought that goes into that behind the actual, combat part of the game. And, games like GTA, Grand Theft Auto, this is a image from Grand Theft Auto 5, and this is the kind of world that I would call hyper-real. So it is almost Los Angeles. It's not quite Los Angeles, it's Los Santos, but they did such a remarkable job of recreating the vibe of LA as the basis for their world building and the culture that happens here. And frankly, as someone who's a native of Los Angeles in Southern California, I think they did a remarkable job at capturing what the culture and the feel of Los Angeles really is, but then they, of course, took it one step away from reality and made it something a little bit different. Assassin's Creed, of course, games like this where it takes place in a very real world place, in real history, things that can be verified by historical documents and all that, and yet they overlay a fictional narrative on top of it. That's another challenge that when we do world building, when we use real history and real location, and yet we're going to impose that fictional narrative on top of it, we have to be careful about how that fictional narrative basically intersects with that real history. Now, of course, games like Minecraft, this whole game is about world building. That's the whole point of this game. And it really is about, teaching people the tools and resources for how you build a world or how you deconstruct it. And I find it fascinating on that level alone. A lot of times when we think about world building, we often automatically go to things like massive RPGs, like I showed, like Skyrim and GTA and things like that. But we can't forget that mobile games as well, such as Limbo here, and some of the other games that we've seen in recent history, those are also very fully realized worlds. They may not have the same level of detail as some of these large RPGs, but that's because they don't really need it. and even things like Angry Birds, which we're all familiar with. There is a narrative to this game. There is a world setting to this game. It might be simple by some people's standards, and yet it is still very valid, the kind of same decisions that go into world building behind even games like this. So what is my point? Basically, any kind of game has a certain narrative structure. It has a world, an environment that has to be built, and there are certain things within those environments that may or may not be compatible with cultures around the world. Now, my inspiration for world building, and I think the inspiration for a lot of us, came from J.R.R. Tolkien with his map of Middle-earth. You know, what he did in his world building process, even though he did it through literary means, not through game development, but he used his core strength, which was language. And so because he was a linguist professor and he was able to create languages like Elvish and Dwarvish and all these other languages, what he did is he used the language as a basis for creating a culture around that language, which then populated this world. And he created this geography using this map, when this is actually an image of the map that he originally created. Now, his strength was not geography, it was not geomorphology and plate tectonics, and I can tell you that right now because of things like the shape of the mountains around Mordor. But that's not the point. He relied on his strength, which was language, and that's how he fleshed out this world. And what I find interesting is that a lot of the fantasy works that we see throughout time, and for some reason this did not animate the way it should have. I don't know if we're running in PowerPoint or not, but I guess not. So that might be a problem later in my presentation. But anyway, my point of this slide is that there's a lot of maps that get created for fantasy works. And the reason why you see almost every single fantasy work, at least in literature, whether it's Westeros or Dinotopia or, you know, whatever it might be, the Thomas Covenant Chronicles, the Chronicles of Narnia, all of these books, they always have a map in that book, because that often is the author's way of kind of solidifying the reality of the world that they created, because we respond as human beings to maps as being factual, and we see them as being something like an artifact of actual exploration and research. And so for a lot of authors, when they create a map and they show it in their book, it's kind of their way of saying, I was there. I went to this place, I experienced it, and now the story that you're going to read is basically the story that I saw firsthand when I was there. So in a way, it almost makes the writer or the creator of that world something of just an explorer who's just kind of relating to you the story that they found when they were in that world. Of course, all of it is coming from their head, but it's an interesting notion, and using the maps in that way often solidifies that relationship between the narrative and the world that was created to give it a certain sense of reality that you would not get if you didn't have the map there to kind of illustrate the world in the context of the world. Now, what's interesting is that if you look at another way that worlds get created, such as in film, like in the Star Wars movie, this is a map of locations used throughout the world to create the Star Wars films, at least episodes 1 through 7. And you can ignore the whole Jedi population by country. We're not interested in that right now. We're only interested in the locations. But oftentimes when film companies go to a real-world location and they use that to film a particular movie, that real-world location then takes on the fictional narrative, and it becomes, to a lot of people, it becomes the place that's from the fictional narrative. And as an example, I mean, I just came back from Norway a week ago today, and in Norway is where they filmed The Empire Strikes Back, the external scenes of Hoth, of the planet Hoth. Similarly, like you can see here, when I was in Tunisia, I went to where they filmed the original Star Wars movie down in southern Tunisia, which was Luke Skywalker's home and Lars' homestead. If you go to Dubrovnik, like for conferences like Reboot, you'll see a lot of people recreate scenes from Game of Thrones, like you could see here, which is kind of a geek thing like I like to do. Or visiting Ireland. When I was in Ireland a couple years ago, right before Gamescom, we went out to the island called Skellig Michael, which is where they filmed some of the scenes from the recent Star Wars trilogy. And so you get this really interesting this interesting relationship, because the island is called Skellig Michael. For a lot of people, it's Octo. It's where Luke Skywalker was hiding out. And in some ways, it kind of, the fictional narrative that we impose on the real place then conflicts with the real history, because actually the island itself is extremely cool. It's a monastery that's over 1,000 years old, and there's a really rich history there, but a lot of people tend to forget that because all they're thinking about, this is Star Wars. This is where Luke Skywalker hung out. Now, yeah, as you can tell, I'm a geek. That's pretty evident by now. It's probably no secret to some people who know me well. These pictures I'm not showing just for the heck of it. It's actually, there is a reason for showing these, because being a geek and working in the game industry and consuming a lot of media like fantasy and sci-fi and all these kinds of things actually informs me and gives me a sense of precedence about what's gone before in different forms of media. But I'm going to get back to that point later on. And yeah, the cosplay, why do I do it? Well, I love to do it, but it's also because my daughter there on the right is a professional costume designer. So, raise your children well and leverage their skills. Now let's get back to the game industry. So the global game industry, as we know, as I hope we realize, is massive. This is the numbers from last year in 2019, and we're still seeing tremendous growth across all the regions of the world. But the interesting thing is a lot of that growth is not happening where a lot of game developers typically think it's happening. So typically what happens is game creators will make their game with the intention, I want to sell in the US or North America, and I want to sell in Western Europe because I know those are big gaming markets. But the reality is that, and I think a lot of people are beginning to quickly realize, that's not where it stops. I mean, last year, for example, in 2019, China surpassed the US as being the largest gaming market in the world. And so China is a massive powerhouse in terms of consumerism. I mean, China has also surpassed in 2019 the US as the largest film consumption market, and it's now in 2020, it's the second largest TV consumption market in the world. So, China has become this massive consumer powerhouse for entertainment media, and it's something that, a lot of game developers are being very aware of. So they're trying to expand their scope and realize that when they're making a game, they're not just making it for the, quote, traditional audience of North America and Western Europe, but they're also trying to make it for East Asia and some other locales as well. What's interesting, though, is that a lot of the growth that is happening within the industry is actually happening in a lot of emerging markets. So, for example, if you read reports like PricewaterhouseCoopers, who does an annual interactive media report, they show that in some markets like Nigeria, for example, 22% year-over-year growth in games. That's staggering amount of growth. In Vietnam, I think it was like 20%. In India, it's 15%. And I know that in my experience in working with a lot of game developers, they're not really thinking necessarily about, making their game for a Southeast Asian audience or for India or for, let alone Sub-Saharan Africa. That really rarely crosses people's minds. And yet the numbers show that there's a tremendous amount of growth in these markets. Granted, most of that growth is in mobile because people can't afford consoles or PCs. It's just not economically feasible under their conditions, but mobile is readily available. And so that's where a lot of people that's where we're seeing the growth. And that's true pretty much worldwide as well. I mean, the tremendous amount of growth, especially projected in the next few years, is all going to be in mobile. So what does that require us to do? If we know that there's a lot of consumers outside these traditional regions, which we traditionally in the past have made games for, then what are we supposed to do? Well, localization and culturalization. I use those terms. A lot of people use those terms. I use culturalization for the work I do. But of course, most people I think are very familiar with localization. And to me, localization primarily is focused on language translation for the most part. Some people may disagree, but I think in most practice, localization is the language adaptability. It's the linguistic translation to make the game content or any content linguistically compatible to the local market. Obviously, that's extremely important. That's something that we've been doing in software for decades, and it always will be important. But the interesting thing is I've been seeing more and more companies are actually thinking about culturalization as the next step because they understand that language is not necessarily where it stops. They also have to understand, will this game content be compatible with that local market, the theme of the game, the gaming experience, all that kind of stuff. Is this the kind of game that people in that market want to consume? And that gets to a deeper cultural level, and that's where culturalization comes in because we're not just talking about language, we're talking about a much broader level of adaptability. So here's an example I want to show you between kind of contrasting between localization and culturalization. So you can see here Kit Kat bars, and they are strawberry Kit Kat bars. For the most part, they're exactly the same. The top one is from Canada, so you can see there's English and French labeling on there, and the bottom one's is from Japan. And so these are effectively the same product. They're the same kind of thing, strawberry Kit Kat, yet in their different wrapper. So that's kind of what localization is like. You've got same product, different language. So that's localization. Now, what's interesting about Kit Kat bars, though, is in Japan, and unfortunately, again, I don't have animations, so I'm going to have to, my content's being blocked. But you can see here that in Japan, Kit Kat bars have taken on a completely different cultural meaning compared to anywhere else in the world. And there's two reasons for that. The first reason is because the name Kit Kat is very similar to the Japanese phrase kitukatsu. And kitukatsu is like this really positive phrase. It's kind of like this victorious phrase that you will use in Japanese. And so the company very smartly decided to kind of play off the term kitukatsu and use Kit Kat. You know, they're just lucky it's that similar. And so that was one reason why the Kit Kat bar got a lot of attention in Japan. They kind of had that very positive cultural connotation. The other thing that they also connected to is the fact that in Japan, collector culture is a very big thing. It's something that a lot of Japanese do. I mean, for example, Pokemon, and gotta catch them all. It's not a surprise at all to me that kind of game came out of Japan, because it's just part of one of the values of Japanese culture in terms of one of the pastimes that people do. And so you can see here on this map that there are, all these Kit Kat bar flavors that were created, and they were regionalized according to what kind of flavors people like in different regions, like in Hokkaido in the north versus like Tokyo and versus other regions. And so they've been doing this for about a decade or more at this point, and there's been, I think, over 600 flavors of Kit Kat bars created in the past 10 years. Compared to how many flavors do we have in our typical market? Maybe 2 or 3. I know we're starting to see more flavors, but this is an example where the Kit Kat bar has been culturalized in a way that is unlike any other country in the world, and it's because they did things that appealed directly to the Japanese sensibility. So when I'm typically doing culturalization on a project, there's 2 types of culturalization that I typically work on. The first is what I call reactive culturalization. So typically, this is where I am asked to look for things that are going to be a problem. And as you can imagine, a lot of companies, they don't want things to be a problem. So this is the bulk of the work that I do. When I work on a new project, they basically want to make sure there's nothing in there that's going to cause a negative reaction from the audience playing this game. Now, the other side of it, though, is called proactive culturalization. And this is where we're actually looking for ways to enhance the product for a local market and to basically make this more appealing to a specific country, specific culture, region, however you want to define the geography around it. Now, again, unfortunately, because I have no animations, what you should have seen here is a 2-headed Brahmin bull. This is a scene from Fallout 3, and this is an example of a reactive culturalization. So in the original game, there's a 2-headed Brahmin bull, and the Brahmin bull, it was radioactive and mutated, obviously, because it has 2 heads. And that was not going to work in India, because in India there are laws that actually protect real Brahmin bulls from being harmed, because the Brahmin bull is sacred to the Hindu faith. And so what we tried to do is go back to the developer and tell them, show them my poorly photoshopped 2-headed horse, which you're seeing now, and say, let's use this instead, because that would have worked. The horse would have been fine. But unfortunately, because of the schedule and because they felt that, frankly, the Indian market, they felt at the time was not important enough to make this change, they didn't make the change. And so because of that one object in the game, the 2-headed Brahmin bull, that's why Fallout 3 did not sell in India, which was really unfortunate. It would have been like one of the biggest, titles of the year in India, even though that market is still growing as a gaming market. Similarly, which again, I'm getting frustrated because I don't have animations for my slides because some of the content is blocked out. But you can kind of see behind there, this is an example of proactive culturalization where Marvel partnered with a studio in India to create an Indian version of Spider-Man. And the initial reaction to that was very positive because people thought this is really cool. We're seeing this culturalized version of Spider-Man, and it takes place in India. And you can see from the image over there on the right that, from the waist up, he pretty much looks like normal Spider-Man, but from the waist down, it's more of a cultural folk costume that you would see in traditional India. And so the initial response was really positive, but unfortunately, this was an example where what people really wanted was they wanted localization of Peter Parker in New York City. Of course, there's like over 100 languages in India, and people know who Peter Parker is. They're dealing with a very popular IP, and so when you're dealing with a popular IP like Spider-Man, people don't necessarily want you to culturalize it to make it adaptable for them because they're already familiar with who the original Spider-Man is. So this is an example where it was really good intentions and people kind of read it as good intentions and they responded well, but ultimately that's not what people wanted in this particular market. So proactive culturalization doesn't always work the way you want it to. You have to really do your research and understand exactly what you're doing. Now, in the process of working with game developers, and as I have for so long now, basically what I'm trying to do is what I would basically see as a gene splicing exercise. So I'm trying to take the game worlds that you're creating and see how they're going to be compatible with the local worldviews that are present in these markets around the world. And so when I'm doing that, basically, this also something happened to this slide. It got turned upside down. So yeah, I don't know what happened to my slides. Anyway, what you're supposed to see is that double helix should be up. It's upside down for some reason. So this is bizarre. So anyway, yay, live streaming. But anyway, you're supposed to see those two ribbons combining to look culturalized content. So basically, you're trying to combine those two, the game worlds and the local worldviews. And I work in that space, which is a zone of compatibility or incompatibility of assets. And so that's what I have to work on. So the other thing that's interesting too, besides this exercise, which is not quite that because it's upside down, when does culturalization happen in the development cycle? Well, typically, most culturalization occurs early on. It does not occur later like localization. Localization has to wait for the text to be mostly done in order for them to start the translation and to really do their work, even though, obviously Loc is involved throughout the whole process, but the core of the work to do the translation has to make sure that the text is pretty much ready to go. Whereas with culturalization, my work often begins on a project very early. So for example, I've worked on all the BioWare projects of the last 17, 18 years, and every one of those projects, we're looking at things right from the start. What's the world's premise? Reading the draft script, looking at the concept art, trying to understand, what is this world? Who is in it? What do they do? Are there politics? Are there religions? Are there other things going on in this world? Because if I can see early on what they're trying to create, I can understand and kind of course correct right from the start whether or not things are going to be compatible with different cultures around the world. And so that's really the key is I have to catch it early, and I can kind of do these little course corrections early on because, of course, that's really cheap and easy to do, comparing to finding that somewhere later in the product cycle where you have suddenly defined something, you say, oh my gosh, we can't do this, and then it's going to be very expensive to fix it. So when we're doing this exercise, though, there are multiple considerations we have to consider. It's not just looking for something and saying yes or no. So first of all, we have to think about the high-level corporate values and goals. And when I say corporate, that means basically anybody who's involved in the enterprise of game creation. That could mean a solo indie developer. It could mean a small team of 5 indie developers. It could mean a massive company of thousands of developers. The point here is that you have to decide, or you will have to decide at some point when it comes to culturalization issues, where you draw the line on what you will or will not change. So for example, if you're releasing a game in China that uses a real map because you've got some fictional narrative that takes place in the real world, if that map does not show if it does not show Taiwan as part of China, your game will not be sold in China. There's things like that, map-based issues. If you show the Taiwan flag, your game will not be sold in China. On and on it goes. There's a lot of different issues, as you'll see later as I get into examples, where things can go wrong. But you have to decide as the game creator, where am I going to say, no, I don't want to change it because that's my vision and I'm going to stick to my vision, versus, yes, I'll change it, I'll do anything you want because I want my game to sell. We'll get back to this point later. The other thing to think about is the context in which content is generated is really important, because my point there is that every single one of us is biased. No matter we like it or not, we are all biased because we all grew up in a certain geographic and cultural context, and we bring that with us through the rest of our lives. Most of us, I think, reach a point of enlightenment where we can see past our bias, or we are educated enough to think past our bias when we're in the creative process. But a lot of times it's difficult to do because it's so inherent in who we are as human beings. And so and I mention this point because it's something we have to be very conscious about. Another thing is thinking about the business strategy for the vertical. Now that is a comment that's often meant for larger companies. For example, Sony and Microsoft, they don't just make games. They make other stuff too. Sony makes all kinds of other stuff. Microsoft makes all kinds of other software. And so they have to position what their games vertical is doing in a certain market versus, say, Office or Windows or hardware or whatever else it might be. We also have to think about the market strategy for the locale. So what are our goals in that specific market? For example, in China, or the market strategy for a specific game, like World of Warcraft. What do we want to do with that game in that market? And then, of course, the other thing is this changing geopolitical and cultural and ethical factors, because I think we all realize, especially in light of what's going on around us at this very moment, the world is a very dynamic place. And I don't mean just biologically and epidemiologically. I mean also culturally, politically, and so on. And things change. So all it takes is one regime change in a certain market, and the rules for content might change. And so you have to be aware of that. So for example, just a couple of years ago, the USK, which is the review board for games in Germany, they changed the rules on Nazi symbology. So you can see here in this image, there are the two images on the left are from, all of the images are from Wolfenstein 2, and you can see that the ones on the left are the ones that people in the US saw, for example, because you're seeing swastikas, you're seeing Hitler with a mustache, and the ones on the right are what people in Germany saw. But now they've relaxed those restrictions. And does that make a difference? It does make a difference, especially for the German market, because up until now, that has been a really strictly controlled thing. And of course, they're still strictly controlling it, but they've relaxed it to the point where at least now you have an option. Which, for whatever purpose your game might have. Another example which happened recently, which I know most of us were all paying attention to, was this whole thing between Blizzard and the Hong Kong protests, and when the winner of their Hearthstone tournament in Taiwan, made comments that were pro-Hong Kong, and they got shut down. And I'm not going to go into the whole story because it's going to take too long. But basically, to me, this was an example of a company that had no clue what it was stepping into. I think Blizzard failed miserably in this example, and their explanations for what happened were really tepid and weak. And so, unfortunately, this is just an example where things kind of went awry for the company, and the politics that were happening on the ground in the moment, I think, caught them off guard to a certain degree. And of course, Blizzard's not alone. They're just a more recent example. So that's why I'm not picking on them. I'm just using them as an example because it does happen. It happens a lot to different companies. So let's talk about core aspects of world building. So there are some things and tools that we employ, or there's ideas behind world building that I want to get into. So setting the context, thinking about complexity, and then the structure of the world. So let's get into this a little bit. So first of all, we've got the real world, and we've got fictional worlds, and then of course we have this broad zone of interlap in between. I think we all realize, especially even from the examples I showed earlier, it is never black and white. I mean, you often have games that are purely fictional because the narrative demands it, and you've got worlds that are completely real world, but they might be in a different time or something else going on, or they're somewhere in the middle. Like I mentioned with Grand Theft Auto 5, it's what I call hyper-real. So it's very close to the real world, but not quite, because it's not our reality, but it's similar. And so that's why is this important? Because it does matter in terms of culturalization decisions. If you're setting your game in the real world and using real geography with real culture and history and all that stuff, you have a different set of rules you have to follow in terms of what your decisions are going to be. The other thing I want to make clear too is when I keep using the term realization. Realization is about how much world you need to create. I'm not talking about realism. Realism is a completely different issue. Realism is like the photorealism of something like GTA or Skyrim or other games like that. That's great. I mean, realism is a design decision which games have to make, how realistic they want it to look. But what I'm talking about is realization. And so what do I mean by that? Well, realization is essentially the combination of the narrative goals of your game and the experience goals. So what's the story behind the game and what is the player actually doing in your game? So that's the most basic level to define what your realization goals are, because the realization goals basically sets out for you, this is how much world I actually need to make. And that's really important, as I'll get into a little bit later. Now, some of the structural tools we have to think about when realizing worlds. So I'm going to talk about all of these individually, but you can see here about cultural evidence, logical consistency, building complex systems using topology, and then establishing kind of this sense of world familiarity by using thematic layers. Now, some of these concepts, as you'll see, are actually from geography, which is why I'm kind of taking this angle as a geographer to sort of infuse this idea into the world-building process that some of these concepts actually, they exist outside the game industry as well. Now, cultural evidence, what I mean by that is essentially that when you're building the world, once you've decided this is the world we're going to create, this is what the narrative is, then building cultural evidence is basically the process of when you're making stuff. And so you're kind of past the concept phase, and now you're basically letting loose all the fantastic creative people on your team, and they're doing what they do best, the artists and the writers and everybody else. But what happens oftentimes during this phase is that people overcreate, and or when they're just kind of building out environments, they just throw all kinds of stuff in there, objects, symbols, banners, all this kind of stuff. And a lot of times they don't really think specifically about what they're creating. They're just kind of dressing up the world and filling it in and making it look lived in or whatever else you want to say. But a lot of times that's kind of when our creative brains are like let loose like that. A lot of times we just kind of throw things into the environment that we may not realize could be potentially problematic. And so that backfilling of the game is a very high risk activity in my view. And so one of the things I often encourage people to do is don't be lazy with creativity. You don't just kind of create stuff because you can. You need to always create with a purpose. So when you're creating an object and throwing it in the environment, you need to think, why is this going into the environment? What does it mean? What relevance does it have to the narrative and all the other things that are going on? Obviously not everything always has to have a direct relationship to the player, for example, because we always see environments that have stuff laying all over the place, but it still should be created with a purpose, not just kind of thrown in there because you're trying to rush down a checklist that some manager gave you. You're trying to get home for the day and not work for 16 hours. The other thing, too, is that somebody on the team has to ask those hard, challenging questions. If they do see like a design that got created, or somebody's got like a character, for example, might have a symbol on their head or something like that, somebody should ask, what does that mean? Where did that come from? What was your inspiration? Now, you don't have to question everything, but I'm saying sometimes having that meta level of question really helps not only the creators step back from what they did and think about what they actually created, but it also helps kind of catch things that may be potentially problematic later on. Now, one of the challenges of that step of asking the hard, challenging questions, and I know from direct experience, is that a lot of creative folks, rightfully so, are very proud of their work, and they're very proud of the work that they created this great drawing, or they wrote this great mission or something like that. And when they get questioned, sometimes we kind of get that creative, I'm not going to say arrogance, it's just kind of creative pride. It's like it's our baby, it's our work. And so we kind of get kind of standoffish and say, well, wait, why are you questioning me about this? You paid me to be an artist, so why are you questioning me? it's not a question to challenge the skill. It's a question to challenge the relationship between what was created and whether or not, again, it fits the realization goals that I outlined earlier. So here's an example of cultural evidence, which unfortunately I can't show you because I lack animation. But this was a scene from Jade Empire that I worked on way back when. And in this corridor, which you can see behind this image, which you can't see, but there was these, originally it looked like prayer wheels like you're seeing now from Tibetan Buddhism. And of course, in the Jade Empire universe, there's not Buddhism per se. It was an Asian fantasy universe, but it lacked, a lot of the real world artifacts like religion and some other aspects. So one of the environmental artists built these prayer wheels into the environment because they said, well, it's kind of this Asian fantasy world, so and it makes sense to have these prayer wheels in there. But we caught this kind of late, and we said, well, no, it doesn't make sense because there's no Buddhism in this game. So for that sense, we actually had to do a quick change. We had to reskin the cylinders so they're kind of these glowing blue cylinders rather than looking like you see right now. So another thing that's really important too is this concept of logical consistency. Besides building cultural evidence, the evidence that you're building and when you're building the world, everything should be logically consistent with the design of the world. So we have logical rules that exist, and they're applied to the space and time and everything else that's within the world. Why is this important? Because, even within Tolkien's universe, for example, much of his universe is built on real world rules of gravity and geomorphology for the most part, hydrology, all of these things, because that world feels very real to us because he took so much of that world and kind of our world and used it as the basis for telling his story. But even so, when he adds things into his narrative, like magic, for example, which exists in Tolkien's universe, the way that magic is used has to have a sense of logical consistency. It's not like everyone can use magic. Only certain people can. And only at certain times do they evoke that power for certain reasons. And those are rules. Now, we may not know every rule behind it because that's up to the author to elucidate that in the narrative and or in other works, because we know there's been all kinds of other writings around the Tolkien works. But it's important for people to understand that if you have something in a game, whether it's something fantasy or bizarre or whatever, it still should be rooted in some kind of logical rule, because that's how we as human beings, we respond really well to that, because in our world there's rules that govern what we do. The physical universe, political space, economic space, all of these kind of things. So we want to make sure that when we're creating things, there's not a contradiction either between the narrative intent that we have and the narrative experience and the world, the content that's in the world. So here's an example. This is from the game Cameo, and this example is a little bit similar to the Jade Empire one, where again, this is a completely fictional universe, has nothing to do with our world, and yet you can see here on this road, there are 2 crosses on the side of the road. And so I asked the artist at the time, I said, so what are these supposed to be? And they said they're grave markers. And I'm like, that's interesting because, there's no Christianity in this universe of Cameo, so why would they be using a wooden cross? That doesn't make any sense. And at the time, the answer I got from the artist was, and I quote, "What else would I use?" And I'm like, I don't know, you're an artist that's getting paid to be creative, maybe create a grave marker that fits the narrative of the Cameo universe. That's somewhere to start. So this example is a little bit about lazy creativity, because I think they just kind of used what they thought would make sense. They kind of pulled it off their mental shelf and plugged it into the environment, but really that object is not logically consistent at all with the Cameo universe, so it really has no place in being there, and so therefore it should be swapped out and something else should be used instead. Another concept that's really important is this idea of topology. So this is where we focus on, topology as, if you've heard the word before, topology is basically, it's not topography, which is, the relationship between distance, elevation, things like that. Topology is the connectivity between things. So like right now, there's a topological relationship between me and you. I'm a speaker, you're an audience. And so that is a topological relationship. So it's basically it's a statement of definition of relationship between two things, irregardless of distance or geography. So this is a concept that a lot of narratives use to basically convey the sense of a much larger world, because you can mention something without having to fully explain it or to go into depth about it, but you've made a connection, and to make the connection is all you need to do. So you can convey a much bigger sense of a universe without actually building that universe and building out the world. So let me give you some examples to try and clarify. And this is a concept that does come from geography, because we use the term topology to describe the connectivity of basically phenomenon on the Earth, irregardless of where it actually exists. But anyway, here's an example. So if you've played the original Halo Combat Evolved, hopefully you have, because it's an awesome game. There are points within this game, and of course, if you've played it, it's a very linear first-person shooter. So really, you're on a pretty linear path throughout the game, shooting things, killing things, doing what you're supposed to do as Master Chief to solve this issue while you're running around on this Halo ring, this alien object. And what's interesting, though, is that you're running around in this environment. You're seeing this really interesting architecture that was made by the Forerunners, which we find out only in later games and in other forms of narrative, where 343 is expanded on in graphic novels and television and other things. But the Forerunners, I remember in that original game, a lot of us were really fascinated by what's the story behind this ring? Why does it exist? And who are these people? Well, the game, the core narrative of the game gives very little evidence about who the Forerunners are and what happened on this ring. But what was really cool is that in the game, there were these things called the terminals. And if you actually found the terminals, you have to make a little effort to find them. But if you found the terminals and you interacted with them, up would pop a screen, and you would have like a text description that, you'd have like a little thing you read for a couple minutes, and it would give you a whole sense of backstory as to what was going on in this world. And so just by doing that one thing, one point of interaction, you click on it, you read something, all of a sudden you've expanded the narrative of the world. You didn't have to build a whole nother level. You didn't have to build a whole bunch of other characters. You basically were able to open a little window into a broader narrative around the universe you've created. So that's one way to handle exposition. It's one way to also handle world building, because you can kind of fill it in that kind of tangential way, rather than filling it in by actually creating the world itself. And it's really effective technique. If you saw the movie Rogue One, they did a great job of it in Rogue One, because for those of us who are hyper Star Wars fans, for example, the character on the left, Chirrut Imwe, they describe him as being a guardian of the Whills, Whills. And for those of us who are longtime Star Wars geeks, that term Whills has been in Star Wars lore ever since the very first Star Wars movie came out in 1977. Now, they didn't mention that name in that movie, but we all knew that George Lucas, he called the original script of Star Wars, something from the Journal of the Whills. And so to hear that term being used in an actual canon film like Rogue One, a lot of us were kind of freaking out, like, they suddenly used that term. Now, what does it mean? We don't know. They didn't go into any detail. All they did was attach that term to one character, and by doing that, they kind of instantly expanded that there was something else behind that character, which unfortunately, at least in that film, we didn't get to explore. In the same way, they would have things like the long shot you see there on the right, where they pull the camera away, and you see this whole mountain range. It's actually like a fallen Jedi statue, which is like, there's a whole story behind that, which is never explored in the film, and yet just by showing that alone, it raises all kinds of questions to the viewer, saying, wow, I wonder what happened here. Well, that's all it takes. That's what topology is. It's kind of giving that hint, that little kind of hook, to make people kind of more interested into what the broader context of what was going on in this world. And a lot of times that could be very effective in expanding the scope of your world without actually doing all the work to build the world, to build it out. Now, why am I, as a geographer, talking about all this? Because, I feel that geographers were actually well suited for world realization, because we spend most of our time deconstructing the real world around us. And so what cartography is, map making, is about world rebuilding. So what we do is we take what's out there in the world, and we basically decide, here's the things that we want to show in a certain narrow view on the map. And so we have to make decisions about generalizing and deciding exactly exactly what elements are going to be on the map, because obviously any map you've ever seen only shows a small subset of what is actually out there in the world. And it often depends on what the purpose of the map is. If it's a road map, you're mainly going to see roads, and then you're going to see cities and some other stuff too, but it's going to focus on transportation networks, versus if you're looking at a map of, like, say, vegetation type, that's going to be a completely different purpose. And the way that we organize this, as you can see there's this layering. This is a geographic information system. That's the primary tool that geographers and cartographers use today to organize the thematic data. And what we do in a GIS is we organize it that way because then we can do analysis between the layers. So if we had a layer, for example, of coronavirus outbreaks right now, and if we had a layer of population density, we could do an analysis between the two and say, is there a correlation between population density and coronavirus cases? The answer is probably yes, as far as we know right now. But that's the kind of thing you can do with a GIS system. Now, we're not talking about doing that in games. The point here is that you've got a sense of thematic layers that you as a game creator can choose from when you're making your world and doing that world realization process. Now, here's a list of just very high-level layers that you could potentially choose from. Now, of course, again, very generalized. This list could go to the center of the earth if you want to make it super detailed on all the different kinds of layers that you could possibly add to a world. I'm just going to take, for example, climatology to start with. When you look at a game like Breath of the Wild, the climate system and the weather system in the game is directly impactful of the gameplay. I mean, you running around on the mountains, you get zapped with lightning, you freeze, all these other things happen. So when they decided to put a weather system in the game like Breath of the Wild, it actually made sense because it has all the direct impact on the narrative and on the experience. Now, I've seen other games that I've worked on and other games I've played where they built a weather system, but it really doesn't do anything. It doesn't impact the gameplay. It's just there for atmospheric purposes. Now, that's okay, but my point in this, and as you go down this list here, like economic systems, for example, I've seen games create vast, complicated economic systems, spend a lot of the developers' time building these economic systems, and then in the end, the narrative did not, and the experience did not demand that the players interact with the economic system very much. So in a way, it's almost like spending all that time and money developing the economic system was more of I don't know what you want to say, an exercise in just seeing how well we realize the world in our heads, even though we don't need it in the actual gameplay. And so my warning to you in bringing this up, and the reason I bring up the layered approach, is to think very carefully about what layers you need to realize the game. Again, going back to narrative goals and experience goals. So you have to think hard about what exactly do you need to do the most minimal construction of your world. And I would recommend you start with that. Of course, most games are going to need some kind of actual geography like land and things like that, and landforms and all these other things, maybe not, depending on your narrative. But, there's a lot of things that are going to be common between a lot of games, but then there's a lot of things that won't be. So you have to think very hard about what exactly do we need to build the most minimal version of the world to serve the experience and narrative goals. And then, if you at least get that far, then you can make decisions after that whether or not you want to add additional layers that might enhance the visuals, it might enhance just kind of the environmental, appeal to the player. But I would not go there until you've at least satisfied the most basic realization needs. So the rest of this talk, or at least part of it, I'm going to talk about what I consider to be the most problematic thematic layers that I've seen throughout my career. And a lot of these are ones you could probably guess, like the use of history, real history, the use of faith, inclusion and exclusion, which is a challenging topic, intercultural dissonance, as I call it, and I will explain all of these in more detail, and then the geopolitical imaginations. So, first of all, history. One of the things we have to be very careful about, and do you need me to stop? No. One of the things we have to be very careful about with history is, especially for those of us who live in countries like in North America, which is a relatively young location, only a couple hundred years or so old in terms of occupation, at least by Europeans. It's obviously much older in terms of occupation by indigenous folks, but the sense of history here is not the same as it would be in somewhere like East Asia, where they've got a culture that is, a lot of cultures in East Asia have been perpetual for millennia. And so it's a much different perspective on what history means. So here's an example from Age of Empires that I worked on. I worked on all the Age of Empires games. In this game, this is the original Age of Empires that released in 1997. And you can see here at the top, the top was the original scenario that was in the game. And this is what history tells us really happened. So what happened is that the Japanese invaded the Korean peninsula, which you can see there on the left. And in red is the Chosun Empire that was in Korea at the time. And the Japanese invaded the Chosun Empire and basically took it over pretty much almost all the way. Now that's what history tells us happened. But then we released the game in Korea, and the Korean Ministry of Information said that never happened. So now what are we supposed to do? Well, remember that slide I said with multiple considerations? This is where we have to really think through some of those factors. So first of all, let's look at the context. It's at a time when Microsoft is growing its games vertical, and it really wants to expand its games around the world. And then the other thing is that we also know from market research that real-time strategy games, RTS games like Age of Empires, are very, very popular at the time, that we got a lot of positive response from people. And if you know your history, your game history in Korea, 1 year later, 1998, that's when StarCraft came out. And StarCraft, of course, has become a national phenomenon in Korea ever since then. And so our RTS games are very popular. We're growing the vertical, so we really feel like this game needs to release in Korea. In order to do that, we're going to have to make some decisions. And so in this case, what happened is that the decision was ultimately made to make a patch only for Korean players, which you can see on the bottom, in which the Chosun Empire invades Japan instead of the opposite. Now, as you might imagine, at the time, it created a lot of debate on the development team, and like really deep debate about the nature of ethics and the nature of truth. And I think it was a very healthy debate to have. Because a lot of people were saying, this is wrong, this is wrong, we're changing history for a specific government. And yet, I also had to remind them, a few years earlier, when I was working on Encarta Encyclopedia for Microsoft, we had, for example, in the French and Italian versions of the encyclopedia, we had different heights for Mont Blanc, because at the time, the governments did not agree on the exact height of the mountain. So that was a fact, a physical fact that was actually different in an encyclopedia. And there were a lot of other facts between the encyclopedia versions that were different. And why was that? Because in the local markets, an encyclopedia has to conform to educational standards. So if this market says this person's the inventor of the radio, and this market says no, this person's the inventor of the radio, we have to change that fact in the encyclopedia according to those different markets, or else it's not going to conform to educational standards, therefore it will not get released in that market. So fast forward a few years to Age of Empires with this problem, and we basically had to reflect on the fact that we've done it before. The precedent has already been set for doing this kind of adaptation for cultural expectation. The other thing I had to point out for Age of Empires specifically is that there are tech trees for every army in Age of Empires, and eventually some of these cultures who are fighting in the game, they have weapons that never existed. So, for example, like the Aztecs eventually have tanks. Well, that never happened, so that's not very historically accurate either. So, you have tanks, Aztecs are having tanks, so is that much different from changing who fought whom, in this battle? And again, I'm not putting a particular moral judgment on which was right. The problem is that, again, going back to that multiple considerations, the company had to decide what they wanted to do in order to actually go forward with their goals as a business, which is sell games in Korea. And in order to sell games in Korea, especially this game, they had to make these changes happen. Obviously, this is going to be different for every particular project, which is actually one of the things I love about my job. The questions are not always the same, and there's always a unique circumstance that comes up that will affect whether or not we can change certain things or whether or not we should change certain things. Now, another thing about history that's important is that more recent events in history can also be very sensitive. So like this game, 6 Days in Fallujah, this was created to basically to recreate a battle of Fallujah in 2004 during one of the Iraq wars. And this game never released because they couldn't find a publisher who was willing to release it, because it was already getting some backlash before it even came out, because people felt it was too sensitive. You know, it's like, this is too recent, especially at the time it was going to be released. This war was still going on. And so people felt like this is just too soon, don't do it. Now, here we are in 2020. Should this game be released now? It's like, maybe there's enough time distance to justify that now. I don't know. But that's one of those questions we have to be very careful about with recent events. The other layer, of course, is faith. So, you know, a lot of the cultures that we send our games into maintain their local expectations based on religious belief, and we have to be very sensitive to that as game creators if we want our games to be, you know, viable in those markets. So, like, for example, both of these games, Kakadu Chojin, which is, I worked on, the game on the left, and Little Big Planet, they both had an audio file that contained chanting or some kind of lyrics from the Islamic Quran. And they both addressed it quite differently. Kakadu Chojin, it was found, I don't have time to go into the full story, but it's a long story. But basically, this one audio file that somebody had put into the game, because their rationale for putting it into the game is they said it sounds cool. But what they did not do is actually understand what the lyrics in that sound file were saying. And they did not know the origin of those lyrics. And so that was the unfortunate part, is that once we found out extremely late in the development process, it was so late, in fact, there were already packaged versions of this game literally on their way to stores at the moment we found this error. And so, to make a very long story short, eventually I had to end up going to the UAE and Saudi Arabia and other places to do damage control, because this caught the attention of the Religious Council in Saudi Arabia. They saw it as a major offense against their faith, and on it goes, because this was an M-rated fighting game, and to have the text from the Quran in that context was highly inappropriate. So there was a lot of things that had to be done, but eventually that game got globally recalled because of one audio file that somebody did not properly check. And so in Little Big Planet, what happened there is they found a similar issue, not the same audio files, something different, but they had a similar issue, and so what they decided to do was delay the release of Little Big Planet by 3 weeks so that they could actually fix the problem. But then in a press release, they actually told people explicitly why they were delaying the release. And when people found out, they said, oh, well, how could you not know that these were lyrics from the Quran? What's wrong with you people? So they still got feedback that was negative, but at least the game they fixed it, they released it, and obviously Little Big Planet and its sequel went on to become very popular. They became successful. Kakadu Chojin was not, because it was globally recalled and never heard from again. So that's a bit of a warning. In Resistance Fall of Man, they decided to recreate the Manchester Cathedral in the UK, which you can see there on the left. And the problem, though, is that they recreated it and they took the fighting into the church itself, which the Church of England really did not appreciate. And so the Church of England had actually asked Sony to fix this and remove it from the game. But of course, at that point, the game is already released and it's already out there, in the world, and it's not easy to, you can't easily recall. But what they did is they eventually came to an agreement, and now the Church of England has what they call sacred digital guidelines. So if you want to use any Church of England facility in a game, or actually other media as well, you have to get their approval, and my guess is you probably won't get approval, especially if you're going to destroy their facility. So you have to be careful. In Hitman, they sort of did something similar, where they took a sacred place, the Golden Temple which is the center of the Sikh faith in Amritsar, India, and they made that the centerpiece of having the main character go into the Golden Temple and actually start killing Sikhs at their most sacred place in the world. That's considered highly inappropriate. So, this is another one that was getting backlash, because it's like, this is really not the kind of place where you have that action occur. And so, that's something they probably should have thought through a little bit more. This game, Smite, they've got a lot of backlash from people of the Hindu faith, because this game, which is a MOBA, massive online battle arena, they took pantheons of gods, like the Norse gods, the ancient Egyptian gods, And they also took all the gods from the Hindu faith. Now, of course, the Norse gods and the Egyptian gods, they're still worshipped by some people, but very, very few, very small minority groups who worship these particular deities, whereas the Hindu faith is, about 1 billion people or so? And so to have the Hindu gods put into this environment and treated as if they're just kind of like these old forgotten gods, so excuse me, similar to like the Norse gods or the Egyptian gods, that was considered highly offensive, and you could imagine why it would be. So some people were joking, why don't you just get it over with and put Jesus, Muhammad, and Moses in there too, and just make it a huge religious battle? Thank goodness they did not do that. But unfortunately, this title they never took the Hindu gods out, despite all the backlash. Now, this category, inclusion versus exclusion, this refers to people who there's a perceived inequitable treatment because of all kinds of reasons, whether it's your gender or your nationality, your ethnicity. There's a lot of different reasons why you could be perceived as feeling like you're excluded from the experience. So, for example, this game, Resident Evil 5, and unfortunately you can't see the images. Again, there's no animation here. But you can see what they had when Resident Evil 5 was coming out is they show these pictures of this Caucasian male shooting sub-Saharan African villagers. And so you've got this nice clean-cut guy going in there and shooting these villagers, and the excuse from the company is like, well, what's the big deal? They're zombies, because in the picture that you can't see under that London news image is that you see one of the villagers has like this big zombie mouth that opens up. And so they said, well, it's not a big deal. It is a big deal, because what the developers did not understand is that showing that kind of imagery, this Caucasian male shooting sub-Saharan African villagers, is really politically and ethnically charged. So that imagery is really inappropriate to juxtapose with each other. It harkens back to what we're seeing here, these images of like the Great White Hunter and the Dark Continent, these really antiquated negative images from over 100 years ago that we've rejected. Excuse me. And so we have to be very careful about this. But this goes back to my point about the context in which content is created. This game was primarily created in Japan, and Japan is 98% ethnic Japanese. So, given that, given the fact that there is a lack of ethnic diversity in Japan, would you expect an average Japanese developer to have a full concept of this problem, of the ethnic tension showing this particular this confrontation? And my guess is no. I think most people may not have that full understanding. In fact, way back in the 90s when I was still working at Microsoft, I actually went to Japan a couple times to give lectures about what diversity is from a Western point of view, because that was at a time when a lot of companies were starting to become more and more aware of the importance of diversity and representation. And so I had to go give lectures and help them understand from a Western viewpoint, at least what we mean by the term diversity. And so it doesn't necessarily surprise me that this came out of Japan, but does that excuse them from any criticism? And my answer is no. They can still do their research just like anybody else would do. So now this game, Pocket God, and again, I apologize there's no animations because it kind of helps you understand what's going on here. This game actually showed indigenous people on this island. The representation of the indigenous people was very antiquated, grass skirts, sharp pointy teeth, a bone in their hair. That was one big problem. The other problem is that on this island, which you can't see unfortunately, but where that stone idol is, there used to be a moai, which is, you can kind of see that image on the side. The moai only exist on Easter Island. Now the developer originally said this game has nothing to do with the real world, it's not real world people or cultures, but because in the original version of the game they had the moai, which only exists on Easter Island, by using that cultural artifact on this little island, they instantly made it a specific culture. That made them the Easter Island Polynesian people. And so that's why what you're seeing there in that image, you're actually seeing a later version of the game where they swapped out the moai and they put in their own version of an idol instead. But you can understand why, because they made that association using that cultural artifact, people of that culture feel really excluded from the experience. They feel offended that they're being picked on in that way. Now, intercultural dissonance, this is a larger category of things where there could be tension over an issue because of, history, like the tension between two cultures or more, could be political. There's a lot of different reasons why these cultures may not interact well with each other. Here's another example from Age of Empires, another example from Korea, and I'm not trying to pick on either, it's just a good example. So when Age of Empires 2 came out, you can see the box art there on the left. The box art had a Japanese samurai on it. Now, at the time when this came out in 1999, a lot of Korean retailers, they did not want to put this box on the shelf. And the reason has nothing to do with the game itself. It has everything to do with a geopolitical dispute between Japan and South Korea. So in the middle of the Sea of Japan, which is called the East Sea by Korea, there are two little rocks. They're called Dokdo in Korean. They're called Takashim in Japanese. And Korea occupies them. They occupy Dokdo. And so every once in a while, the two countries have this heightened tension over this geopolitical dispute over these rocks. And when that happens, you get a certain political, energy going, and people in the society start, having sort of anti-Korea or anti-Japan sentiment. Well, that's what was going on exactly when Age of Empires 2 was releasing. So a lot of retailers said, I don't want anything with related to Japan going on my shelf, which is why they didn't really like the samurai on the box. Now, when the expansion pack came out several months later, you can see that most of the world saw that image on the top right, which had Montezuma front and center in the box art. But in Korea, we actually put a Korean general, which is sort of a way to say, hey, we're sorry for the samurai. We still love you as our customers. Here's a box that is customized specifically for you. And so that was sort of a way for making up for it. But the whole point about this example is that a lot of times it's not about the games we've created, it's about the political, social, cultural context into which the game is being released at that moment. So that's why part of the job that I do when I'm working with companies, it's not just about the representation and realization in the game, it's also about looking forward, about seeing when is this game releasing and what is actually happening in certain markets while this game is releasing, because that's very important. Another game like Dance Central, I worked on all the Dance Central games. You can see here there's gestures being displayed, where gestures are one of those things that are highly culturally specific. So you can see there on the left, he's doing kind of this thing like this, and it's a dance move. He's doing this. It's not too dissimilar from doing this, which I think most of us would recognize is this. And so, but he's close, and so some people may see it the wrong way. Now, she's doing this over her head, which I think for a lot of us means rock on, so it's kind of positive. It's related to rock and roll. Now, if you're from Texas, you'll probably think that's the University of Texas, because they use this gesture, and they say hook 'em horns. If you're from Italy, it can mean I'm sleeping with your wife, or it can mean that you're a cuckold. It has a negative meaning in Italy. That's my point. So, so you have to be really careful about gestures, extremely careful. For example, I gave a lecture at the Facebook headquarters a few years ago, and I pointed out to them that this gesture, the thumbs up, is actually the same as this in some countries. But yet that's the corporate symbol of Facebook. Maybe that's appropriate. I don't know. But anyway, we have to be very careful with gestures and be very mindful that if you're going to have gestures in a game, you have to be very careful about how they're portrayed and think through the context. Like if you're going to use gestures for icons and things like that, we have to be very careful. Another thing, like representation, like with Lara Croft, I think to me, it's fascinating to see how Lara Croft, as a representation of gender, has really transformed over the years. Now, unfortunately, not every female character in games has followed this path, but I think her path is really interesting because there was a time where Lara Croft was really seen as the epitome of a sexist representation in a game, which I would agree with those early versions. And yet now, in the later versions of the games, where we've seen her rebooted, and her physical form is much more natural and much more, I guess, normal, you would say. But even more so, which was really interesting, is that when you get great writers like Rhianna Pratchett to breathe life into the character and to give her emotional depth that really wasn't there as much before, before, that also changes the nature of the character. So I think this is one particular character which has transformed from being one of the more negative representations of women in games to being one of the more positive representations now. When I think it's a really interesting transformation, especially that this character has been around for decades. You don't see the joke on this one because there's no animation. I'm sorry, so I'm just going to skip it. This one is interesting because this was an example of how subtle these issues can be. So this is not games related, but the reason I want to show it is because it's a really effective example for the subtlety. So the image on the left was a desktop image that was going to be the default desktop image for a special version of Windows for the Indonesian government. And so it was going to be given to Indonesian government, and that you could see the image has like this filtering thing on it, where red filter at the top and blue at the bottom, which is, sometimes they use that filter, in films and everything else. Well, what's unfortunate about that particular filter is that, as you can see, it's very similar to the Dutch flag, the flag of the Netherlands. And if you don't know, Indonesia was a colony of the Netherlands up until 1949. And so to send that kind of message to the Indonesian government in a special version of Windows and to have that filter overlaid, that can be particularly very sensitive. I actually tested this with an Indonesian colleague without telling them any context. I showed them the image on the left, and I said, "What do you see here?" And they said, "Well, that's Lake such and such with a Dutch flag on top of it." I'm like, "Okay, got it. You've basically verified my suspicion." So we have to be really careful about things like this too. Finally, the last layer that can be sensitive is what I call geopolitical imaginations. Now, this is where it mostly involves governments who use cartography and maps to reinforce what they believe they own, the territories they own out here in the real world. And they use maps as a form of propaganda, and they use maps as a form of enforcing their political will on the content creator. So, for example, in the game Hearts of Iron, both of these games were banned in China because you could see here the circled areas, Taiwan and Tibet, were not being shown as part of China. Now, what's interesting, though, you can see that China is divided up into all kinds of pieces. China's not shown as one particular country, because this game, if you've never played these games, it's kind of like the board game Risk, where you're just basically trying to take over the world in different pieces all over. But they didn't like the fact that Taiwan and Tibet were being specifically shown not the same, and so therefore they banned the game. What's interesting, though, is that these games take place during World War II, which ended in 1945. The People's Republic of China did not come into existence until 1949. And so the government is actually reinforcing their sovereignty over territory before they even existed as a modern political entity. So it's a really interesting problem that you have to deal with some of these issues, and it can be very tricky. Here's another example, which again, because of the lack of animation, I can't show you, but you can see where it says country/region Taiwan. Originally, in the original option screen here, it said country, and then it had the Taiwan flag, and then it said ROC. ROC meaning Republic of China, which is a forbidden term to use for Taiwan in China, just like you cannot use the Taiwan flag either. And so what we had to do is basically modify it to what you're seeing now. So instead of saying country, which would have been a highly charged political statement to say that the Republic of China is a country. So what we did is we used country/region, and then we used the name Taiwan because Taiwan is used by both Taiwan and by China, and we took the flag out because it's redundant information. And so then you have a UI screen like this. So is Taiwan a country or is it a region? That's for the user to proceed. If you happen to be in mainland China, you'll probably say it's a region of China. If you're an independence-minded person in Taiwan, you'll say it's a country. So basically what you did by that quick little change is you deferred the perception to the user rather than you having to be, have that decision on your own shoulders and have to defend that decision. So also look for opportunities like that. If you can defer the perception to the end user, then that actually helps you as a creator to kind of sidestep some of these complicated issues. Now, finally, as I'm closing out, I want to talk about a few key considerations that we have to think about in the broader sense around culturalization. So first of all, the target audience. So in my perception, in all the time I've been working in the industry, I kind of see two key audiences for game content. One is what I would call the intended audience. So those are basically people who play games anyway. Frankly, they don't really care about most anything I've said in this entire lecture. They only care if the game sucks or not. Honestly, they're more about the gameplay. It's like, is this fun? Am I going to keep playing it? Is it boring? That's the kind of stuff they're more focused on. And so in terms of proactive and reactive culturalization work, the proactive work is done more for those people because they're already game players who are basically, they understand the contextual issues in games, and they're avid game players. So when we do proactive work, we're really trying to enhance this experience for those intended players. The other group is the unintended audience. So these are the people who tend not to play games. These are the people who have knee-jerk reactions. If they see one screenshot of something that they don't like, that's the kind of thing that sends them running to the government and complaining and saying, hey, I don't like this. Games are evil. We need to regulate games. I don't want my kids seeing this. And so the reactive work that I do to try and eliminate that kind of knee-jerk is often focused at those people, the unintended audience, because we don't want them knee-jerk reacting to this kind of content and misunderstanding our intent as creators. The other thing we have to think about is distribution in the content cloud, because we know today most everything is distributed digitally. Even if it's physically distributed, it doesn't matter. We know it's going to be digital within minutes. It's going to be on the streets of different markets around the world by next morning, being sold for like €1 or whatever on a disc. And that's just the way the world works. So we know that there's going to be instant exposure and reaction to any content we create. We know that it's going to be exposed to a broad multicultural audience immediately as soon as we release it. And the other thing too, which I think we're all aware of right now, is that there's a massive community of people on social media where activism takes place. And so if you do something that they love, like release a game that they like and they like, you will get an outpouring of love, and it's just an amazing feeling. But then if you do something wrong or do something that they don't like add one thing in your game that could be problematic for a certain market or for wherever, the kind of backlash you get, as I think all of us are aware, can be overwhelming on social media. So you've got that community aspect that's watching your every move. And then the other issue that we also have to be aware of is what I call the mindshare issue. So oftentimes when I'm trying to negotiate with a government to help a game developer to get their game released, a lot of times it comes down to this core issue of who gets to control the public mindshare and perception in a particular market. Who gets to define the local cultural narrative? Who gets to decide what influences citizens in a certain market? This is certainly not limited to games. This is an issue of all creative media faces. This is why the Great Firewall of China exists, because the government of China is fearful of the external influence of all this media on its populace. In the same way that late last year in 2019, the Russian government, I feel unfortunately, approved what they called their sovereign internet law, which basically is sort of going to become similar like the Great Firewall of China, which basically they have their own internet in which they get to define for themselves what reality is. And I think that's a dangerous trend in this world. So, but this is a very core thing about why these culturalization issues often become a problem, because at their very base level, it's this battle over mindshare. And I've seen this happen time and time again over the many years I've been doing this work. And so I often try and educate developers during the process of helping them that this is something they need to be very careful about. And it directly ties back to the issue of where you as a game creator, what are you willing to change or not change? Now, to my point about precedence that I mentioned earlier with my cosplay pictures, basically the reason precedence is really important is because it's the work that I do. I'm always looking for if a government allowed it in a film or some other medium, or maybe they allowed it in another game that came out a few years ago, because knowing the precedent is super important, because in the same way that a lawyer will go look up previous legal cases to see if that supports their case, I do the same thing to understand that, maybe a government's, saying something about your game being released, but then if we find out that, well, wait a minute, a few years ago they let this other game do the exact same thing. So what's changed? Now, like I said before, it could be there's a regime change and the regulations are more strict now, or it could just be that the government, whoever's on the rating board, they're new people, they don't remember what happened back then. But knowing the precedents is really important for trying to defend our work as creators. Now, lastly, the very last point I want to bring up, because this almost always comes up when I give a lecture on culturalization, is about freedom of creativity. So I think a lot of people, when they hear a talk like this, they're like, well, wow, this sounds like I need to change everything because I'm supposed to make everybody happy. No, that's not my point. My point is that you need to exercise your creative vision the way you want to exercise it and follow through with your creative vision, but you can't expect that creative vision to translate and align with expectations and cultures all around the world. And so you have to be extremely conscious of the fact that all of the creative decisions you're making during the world building process will have some dimension that either will be compatible or incompatible with those markets. And it's up to you, and you alone as the game creator, or your small company or your large company or whoever, you need to decide what is ultimately more important to you. Is it artistic freedom? In which case you release anything you want. You don't really care of the backlash. And at the same time, if that is your goal, that also means that you're willing to give up different markets that may not agree with your game's content. And that means lower revenue as well. But you have to decide where do you want to, what is your priority? Maintaining pure artistic freedom or maximizing the revenue options that you have, in which case if you want to maximize revenue, that means you have to be safer and probably make more changes in order to satisfy more people around the world. And this tends to, not always, but this scale that you're seeing right here tends to, in my view, kind of outline the core difference between what I would think are indie developers and kind of the large AAA. Indie developers tend to focus more on the artistic freedom aspect because it's a pet project or it's a personal project, and it's deeper and closer to their form of self-expression. And so I think it's closer to the core of who they are and their artistic goals, whereas the AAA companies, because they're larger machines that churn out these franchise games, and that's not a criticism. A lot of these games are very well made, extremely well made, but they often don't take risks in the same way that we see in the indie space, where they tend to have more artistic freedom. The last Call of Duty is not that much different in its character than the ones that came before it. Technically, yeah, it's a marvelous thing, but the actual gameplay and all of that, is it really that much different from the games that came before? It's not necessarily. It's serving a given established audience and giving them what they want, and there's nothing wrong with that either. So again, I'm not making a value judgment on what's better, artistic freedom or maximize revenue. The reality is I think every single one of us, both individually and collectively, we struggle with this all the time. And I think it's really important for you to understand where you kind of fit, and kind of have that introspection about where you fit on this scale. And you can see at the bottom, I say, this is the fulcrum of compromise, because I think for most of us, we have to compromise on what's important to us. And it's never easy, and it's never the same from one project to another either. It depends on the nature of your project. So I leave you with that to think about in the context of these culturalization issues. I think it's extremely important that you think about the culturalization aspect of your work, because it will be seen by this broad multicultural audience. But as you're doing it, make sure that you feel comfortable with where your own stance is on what you're willing to change or not change. Basically, ground yourself on some kind of internal logic, whether it's corporate values or personal values or whatever it might be, but you really need to ground yourself in some kind of logic, because that's the only way ultimately you're going to be able to weather some of the storms that can come up related to the culturalization issues. So thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate it. And
we have a question for you.
Yes, we have a question.
So about the creative process. So when an artist presents the creative work to the client or players and receives negative feedback, as it often can happen with different cultures and different releases in different markets, how to not take this criticism personally, and how to start building a thick skin to avoid being hurt by this negative feedback.
Okay. So just to paraphrase the question just briefly, so the question that I just got was basically when you're presenting your work to like a publisher or to a certain market or whoever the representative might be, and you're getting negative feedback on your vision, especially if that negative feedback might be based on their particular cultural context, how do you deal with it? How do you develop that kind of resiliency and that thick skin to be able to weather that kind of criticism? Well, first of all, I mean, that's a great question, so thank you. One of the things that I would say is that you first have to be confident in your creative vision to begin with. And so, do you like what you're creating? Are you satisfied with the direction of what you're creating? Because ultimately it's your creation. You own it. It's your vision. And so, do you expect, it kind of goes back to my last point, do you expect your creative vision to be liked by everyone in the world? Now, I think for all of us who are creative types, in our best hope, yes, we would love for everyone to love us, but we know that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. It's not reality. So you basically have to decide, listen very carefully to the feedback they're giving you. First of all, be very conscious of what they're telling you and try and understand exactly what they're saying. So, if their feedback is very specific about a certain cultural aspect that they're not uncomfortable with it, they don't like a certain representation of a character, they don't like something else that you put into the game, listen to the feedback very specifically and then decide, okay, it sounds like they're asking us to change this in order for our game to be acceptable in their market. So first of all, discern what are they asking, basically what are they saying, what are they asking for, are they saying like if you do this, then it'll be okay. So you have to be clear on exactly what they're asking you to do. And then the other part of it is this, and then basically you have to decide then, are we going to follow through and change it according to what they're saying, or are we just not going to do it? You have to, developing that thick skin partially comes through practice, going through this a lot and having a lot of multiple feedback sessions, some of which will be very positive, some of which probably won't be very positive at all. But you have to kind of ground yourself in the fact that this is the game we want to make. This is our narrative. This is our vision. We're very confident in that. We've spent a lot of time on it. And so then it comes back to whether or not you feel that particular market is really going to be that, consequential to you. Is this something like if it's China? A lot of game creators out there, because of, like I said earlier, China's a massive gaming market now. If China comes back to you and says, yeah, we want you to change this or that, a lot of game creators probably will make those changes because they want to sell in China. But a lot of times that comes at a high cost because depending on the game, what China is asking you to change might be really fundamental to your game. And so you have to make that decision. Do we really want to go through all that work in order to appease one country? And that one change for China may not be compatible with other markets around. For example, the China, Korea, Japan cultural relationship between those three markets is highly complex and it's very contentious. And so, like, if you make a change to make China happy, then you may need to make a change to make Japan or Korea happy, or something like that. So you have to be very careful about that sort of slippery slope. You make a change for one market, and are you going to start going down that slope? So you have to be very careful about it. But remember that the feedback you're getting is from their specific cultural perspective. That doesn't mean they're actually, they may not be focusing on your creative vision at all necessarily, whether or not it's right or wrong. What they're really basically focusing on is whether or not they feel it's going to be compatible for their specific location. So try not to take it personally. I know it's hard to say. I mean, the more you do it, the more you kind of get used to the fact that you will get different feedback from different markets because we are a wonderfully diverse world with many different cultures and different ways of looking at things. And so you just kind of have to get used to that fact. Now, the last thing I'm going to say, I'm sorry, this is a very long answer. The last thing I'll say, though, is if you're hearing the same kind of feedback from different markets, I would really listen to that carefully, because if you're hearing similar feedback on a certain issue in your game across multiple markets, then that might be a sign of some bigger problem that you need to focus on, and maybe you do need to walk it back a bit and think about making a change, because if it's being recognized as an issue by so many different markets, then it could be a bigger problem. That's it. So is that the only question? Okay. Well, you've got my email, you've got my Twitter. If you have any questions around this topic, by all means, please reach out to me. I'm always more than happy to help people out. Again, I wish I could have been with you here in San Francisco for GDC. We will be back here next year, let's hope. But anyway, wherever you are, hunkered down, self-isolating, I hope things are well with you. So thank you.
Thank you, Kate, for a great talk. And I want to also remind everyone that our videos will be uploaded on the YouTube channel. So subscribe to the YouTube channel to make sure that you get notified once the videos become available. And other point is that we'll have also talks tomorrow that will continue. So all of the updates will be posted within our Facebook group chat and Facebook group, which is Plan B Project. So like and click interest button on our Facebook page to make sure that you're not missing on all the future presentations. And we'll continue tomorrow. And special thank you to Kate also to help to organize this event. Also to Felder Van Herpen, who is the founder of Meet to Match, who was not able to come here, but he also helped a lot with organizing the event, and also Anorgande from Terminal 3 by Payment Wall, who also was kindly enough to provide all the equipment and everything needed to be able to stream these talks. So thank you everyone, and we'll continue tomorrow.